Thank you. And thank you to Data Science Festival for giving me this opportunity to talk to you about something that's probably fairly different to many of the other talks that you've had today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a brief introduction to the National Biodiversity Network Trust. I'm going to talk to you about how we collect data, some of the problems we have with the data, and then, as promised, how this data is helping save the planet. So the NBN Trust is a charity. We were set up in the year 2000, and our main purpose is to promote the collection, curation, sharing and use of wildlife data. The idea is that the data will be collected once, and then it will be aggregated, and then it can be used for multiple times. And we're talking about use for things like planning decisions, government policy decisions, conservation projects, that sort of thing. We work with 160 data providers who provide the data to us. We don't collect any of the data ourselves. And they can range from the big conservation NGOs like RSPB, BTO, the government organisations, so we've got Natural England, Scottish Natural Heritage, Natural Resources Wales and so on. And it's right down to individual volunteers who go out and collect the data and then share it via us. And the main way that we share the data is through our digital data sharing infrastructure, which is the NBN Atlas. I'm not going to. The NBN Atlas has been in place since 1st of April 2017, so it's still fairly new. And it took over from our old gateway. And the Atlas is much more powerful now, and it's going to enable people to look at wildlife species data in combination with habitat data, soil pH, climate data, and all of that sort of stuff. I'm not going to go through what the Atlas does in too much detail. I'll just give you a quick overview. Otherwise, I could stand here for hours telling you all the wonderful things that we can do. But, so on the NBN Atlas, as I say, all the data is aggregated from different organisations that collect data. We've got over 222 million species observation records. Now, to me, that sounds like a huge amount of data. I'm sure to some of you that's a drop in the ocean. But when we're talking about the wildlife data, that's actually quite a lot. And it does cover 72,000 species. On the Atlas, you can look at the different species, so you can find a species of interest. It will give you a page like this. It will give you some pictures of it. It will give you some general information about the natural history and the behaviour of the animals, and it will give you an interactive map that you can look at that shows you the general distribution. And it will also include things like if it's on a protected species list or on the IUCN red list, so on. And then you can go into the interactive app and interactive map, and you can then filter it and look by lots of different facets that are important to wildlife data conservation. You can also look at it through exploring your area for looking at locations. So this little map here is what's been recorded and what's on the Atlas in a 2-kilometre buffer of this very building. So as you can see, even though we're in the middle of London, there's still quite a lot of data that's available around here. And you can also, if you want to, go in and draw your own polygon, import your own GIS files, so you can be really specific about what areas you want to look at. And the data we've got goes back quite a long way. So one of our earliest records was this peregrine falcon, which was found just off the Norfolk coast in 1605. We've got a polecat just near Skipton that was recorded in 1620. And then that's not just a domestic cat, that actually is a wild cat, which was found in Scotland in 1620 as well. It looks quite like a domestic cat, but it's not. So we've got data going back 400 or 500 years, plus the most recent data will only be about a week old. So we've got a huge span of data and a huge time span of data as well. On the Atlas, this shows you the coverage that we've got. So the map on the left is the number of actual records, so each species observation per 10 kilometre square. And the one on the right is the number of taxons, so that's the number of groupings of similar animals, so like birds or mammals or so on, per 10 kilometre square. And as you can see, we've got quite a good distribution coverage in England and Wales, not quite so good in Scotland and Northern Ireland, unfortunately. But this sort of information can help us to target areas that we need to go and look for more data in. Either, getting people to look more in Scotland and in the Highlands there, or to go and look for particular species. So where do we get the data from? We've got a rich history of biological recording, as it's called, in the UK that does span back to the 1500s, 1600s. And it's a blessing and a curse, because we've got a lot of information, we've got a long time span of information, but because we've got multiple organisations that have all grown up organically, they all do what is essentially the same thing in very different ways. And so that makes it difficult for when we want to use that data together. So on the whole, in the UK, the vast majority of data about wildlife is still collected by volunteers. And the usual way that we have it is that we will get people, like the guy in the picture there, they will go out into nature in their free time, look for wildlife, and then record it. And they record it in multiple different ways. So we still have, to date, what you might think of a more sort of Victorian naturalists, where they have a notebook that they write down their sightings in and draw some little illustrations. Take my photo while I'm drinking. And then we can get these sort of recording cards that some of the schemes and societies give out, or they can record it on an Excel spreadsheet. And increasingly, people are using apps to record data, which actually makes things a lot more interesting in some ways. So the one that's shown there is a mammal tracker app. So if you go out, you see a deer or whatever, you can just click on your smartphone, and then that data will give you a lot of the information that we need for the wildlife data. And wildlife data essentially is the 4 W's. It's the who, what, where, and when. So who saw it, where did they see it, what did they see, and when did they see it? And the vast majority of the volunteers that collect the data, they like to have their name with the record that they've collected. So that has caused a few interesting issues with GDPR recently as well. And as you can see, we've got all this long history, but really since the beginning of this century, the amount of data has increased massively. And a lot of this is to do with technology and with the apps and so on. You can also now have online recording, which wouldn't have been around about 20 years ago. So this is where you go to a site online, surprisingly. A couple of the ones that we use in the UK are iSpot or iRecord, and then there's iNaturalist, which is more of a global one. And you just go on there, you upload your photos, you give it all information, and then that goes directly into a database as well. Also, social media has come a long way in helping to bring people together and to showcase wildlife observations. And now that pretty much every smartphone has got a decent camera, pretty much anyone can take a reasonable picture of the wildlife that they see. The downside with this is that information doesn't then really go anywhere. If there was a way of harvesting the information that there is on the photos in social media, so that picture of a hedgehog, for example, if we could take the information, if it's got the GPS location of where it's taken, the time and date, and if we could then bring that into something like the Ambient Atlas, that would improve the amount of data that we have enormously. So at the moment, social media is good for getting people involved, engaging people, building up a bit of community, but it's rare that the data that's there often actually gets into somewhere where it can then be used. We also have an issue with data quality with wildlife data. So it goes through 2 stages. So we've got the validation, which is fairly easy. All the usual tests, but in this case also making sure that the coordinates that they give for the location of the sighting are right, making sure it's got all of the different bits of the information that we need to go onto the data record. And we also have an issue with verification of data. So because at the moment the majority of records are down to human observation, humans are obviously not infallible. And we need to be really sure that the data that we're sharing is right. We need to specifically be sure that it's the right species that's on there. And so Data verification is also done by volunteers generally, and it's quite a small number of people who have got the expertise to be able to go in and verify the data that's been supplied. So, I mean, we've got species like this. I'm hoping that the vast majority of you in the audience will be able to identify those species, so that's fairly easy. Although they still do go through a human verification step. We then go on to some species like bees, which are a bit more difficult to identify. You might need to use a key, you might need to ask somebody else who knows a bit more about bees as to where have you put the right species down. And then we have things like the marble moth here. And the only way you can correctly identify this is if you dissect it and look at its genitals. But that's a sentence you weren't expecting to hear at a data science festival. So for some of them, they can be really difficult to do, and that's where we get a real problem. And as I say, there's a shortage of verifiers in a way. Not everybody's got the experience to look at moth genitals and tell you if it's the right species. But it is an area where I think AI and machine learning might be able to help out a lot. If we could make it so that all the ones on the left side there, if they could just go through an automated verification, that would get rid of a huge amount of the records, and then the verifiers could concentrate on the harder to identify ones. We're also getting a lot of new sources of data now. Still, the majority of the data is provided by volunteers going out and looking at it, but we also have things like remote sensing, so it's a light image detection, gives you the picture on the left. We've got drones that can go out and do things like vegetation habitat surveys, similarly with remote sensing with the satellites. And we also have things like camera trapping that we can use. And the little video there that you can see is of a honey badger. And there was an experiment trying to see if they could stop honey badgers getting into beehives, so the Boxer's beehive. And really, I've been wanting to use this video forever because it was randomly sent to me. Here's a video of a honey badger, and that's kind of spam I like, actually. So, but yeah, camera trapping also has the ability to give us a lot more data. And if we can then start using things like image recognition for those type of photos, then again, we can bring in as much more data to the site. Because of the way that data collection has grown up in the UK for wildlife data, we have quite a complicated data flow system. And believe it or not, this is an incredibly simplified data flow. We have some people who we know don't share their data at all. Well, it's their hobby, their interest, they don't really care about anyone else seeing what they've got. We have some people or some organisations that will share it with certain individuals but not with others, and various other political, with a small p, issues going on in the background. And so we know that there is wildlife data out there that we don't have, and we're probably never going to have all of the data that's collected around the UK. But we're getting there, we're making improvements in it. And another thing that's had an impact on the sharing of wildlife data is the open data issue. So, I should have said before, the Embryonic Atlas is an open source development. It was first developed, it's based on the Atlas of Living Australia, which was, again, developed open source. So everything that we're doing to develop the Atlas is available for other people to use as well. But when it comes to open data, we've got a slightly different problem. So as I've just said, we obviously have some people who don't want to share their data at all, so that's obviously closed. And then we have some that will only do it with particular groups or people. And then we have others that will allow it to be used for public work or conservation work, and then some that will allow the data to be used for absolutely anything. As I said, the majority of data comes from volunteers, and that's not free, even though they're giving up their time for free. You can't just go on, here you go, here's an Excel spreadsheet, that's your data. There's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done in supporting the volunteers, in aggregating the data together, in curating it, in getting it verified. And most of that work is done by the national schemes and societies, such as the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, or Butterfly Conservation, or one of those types of groups. Or we have a network of local environmental record centres in the UK, and there's one in every county. And they bring together, so whereas the schemes and societies, it's one taxa really, the local record centres bring together the data on a geographical scale rather than a species or taxon-based scale. And the work that they do to do all of that data management is usually unfunded. And they then rely on selling data services based on the data that they've got primarily for planning applications. And so they worry that if they put all of their data up on an open license, then that will mean that they will lose their income, and then that will mean that we won't have the volunteers to go out and do the data collection. And there's been a bit of a conflict between the government agencies who are pushing for everything to be open and these organisations that obviously need to keep themselves going in some way. So we are mainly in the public access and the open access, but we've got a little bit of way to go before we can share it all openly. So the NBN Atlas covers the UK and the Isle of Man, and we collect, once the data comes to the NBN Atlas, in all of its different formats, we then make it all into one format, which is the Darwin Core, and that's an internationally recognised standard for biodiversity data. And one of the reasons for putting it in this standard is so that we can then share our data with GBIF, which is a Global Biodiversity Information Facility. And it's funded by the world governments and hoping to provide access to everyone for the data across the world. And they've got 1.3 billion species occurrence records on there as well. And they... totally forgotten what I was going to say there, sorry. And so, so that gets the data shared more widely. So this is a map of the GBIF data. This is data going back to, again, the 1600s, so the majority of that was just in Britain. And obviously, the redder it is, the more data there is provided. And so you can see that the UK is very red in there, and we actually provide the second... UK organisations provide the second largest amount of data to GBIF, which is quite impressive given how small we are, but we do have the history. So this is great. Yeah, we told you all about the data, how we collect it. How can it help save the planet? Well, biodiversity itself is obviously it's the diversity of nature, and it's essential to the planet's survival. So WWF say we can't survive without it. So David Attenborough, who is obviously the god of this type of thing, says that it's an essential part of human life, and we need a healthy planet. And so preserve biodiversity, save the planet. And so how does the actual data part of it do this? Well, any decision. One of my colleagues at Natural Resources Wales came up with this, and I think it's a great quote. Any decision taken in absence of good data is basically just a guess. So we need the data, we need the robust species ID, we need all of the checking and quality on it to make sure that we're looking at what we need to. And Lord Kelvin, who is more well known for the temperature scale than data collection, said if you can't measure it, you cannot improve it, and that's particularly true for wildlife. If we don't know what's here now, how do we know if what we're doing is increasing or decreasing the amount of biodiversity in the world? So one of the main ways that the data from the volunteer recorders is used is to look at trends in wildlife species. And one of the most high-profile reports on this is the State of Nature report. The first one was in 2017, the next one was in 2016, and there's one going to be published this September as well. And this brings together data from about 50 organisations and looks at the number of species to see what is happening, what's going on with those species. And over 7.5 million hours of volunteers goes in every year is put into recording data for the wildlife, which I think is incredibly impressive. And they've monitored nearly 10,000 species across the whole of the UK. And that has gone into this report. The report's results basically showed us that nature is in trouble. I think we're all aware of that. The Biodiversity Intactness Index is a measure of how much of our native biodiversity we still have left. And quite embarrassingly, the UK is 189 out of 228 countries. Our biodiversity has been quite severely depleted over the years. 165 of our species are critically endangered or extinct, and it's just continuing to decline, including things like hedgehogs and turtle doves are actually declining quite a lot. Climate change is obviously having an impact. It's not all doom and gloom. Otters, red kites, bitterns are all increasing, but we've got a lot more that are decreasing rather than increasing. And one of the things it mentioned in that report was the impact of climate change on biodiversity. There was a recent article on the BBC News about how the UK's birds are being affected by changing climate. And that's because that can be detected because people are going out and recording when things like the first eggs are laid or the first young are hatching. And we've been able to tell that these events have been happening much, much earlier in the year than they had been normally. Similarly for things like frogs are spawning more earlier. Some plants are flowering much earlier than they would have done before. And this is all related to the climate. And this is all related to the fact that we're getting warmer springs, that we're not having such harsh winters, is affecting the day-to-day life, if you like, of a lot of our biodiversity. We've got another issue with climate change is the change in species distribution. So what we're seeing in the UK generally is that species are moving north. So in the map on the right-hand side there, the yellow and the green, the yellow at the bottom was the distribution of this bush cricket before 1980. And the green was in the 80s, lighter blue in the 90s, and then the darker blue over the last sort of 15, 20 years. And as you can see, that range is moving higher and higher. And that's just following the colder temperature that those species need. We also have an issue with invasive non-native species in the UK, and we're hoping that the volunteers that go out and record the data for us can pick up if we are getting new species coming into the country. So invasive non-native species usually are bad. The second biggest impact on global biodiversity is caused by invasive non-native species after biodiversity loss or habitat loss. And the idea is that if we can spot it quickly, we can deal with it. We can either eradicate them or we can, do something so that they won't have such an impact on the UK's wildlife. Unfortunately, the species that I'm showing you there, which are some of the most well-known invasive species, we didn't actually do too great a job on dealing with those when they first came in. And so we're now having quite a lot of time and money invested in trying to move those species out of the UK because they are having impacts on our native species. The data that's collected by volunteers can be used for things other than just trends and distribution. They're used in a lot of peer-reviewed scientific papers, looking at the effects of climate change, looking at the amount of biodiversity inside and outside a particular area, and thankfully protected areas do actually have more biodiversity, which is a good way forward, otherwise we'd be doing something very wrong. And so the data that we have, although a lot of it is unstructured, it's not done to certain survey standards, it's still incredibly useful to the scientific world. And we've also been able to look at what human impact on biodiversity has been through the data that we collect and share on the Ambient Atlas. Again, another recent news story showed that there is a threat to biodiversity because of the food that we eat. So in terms of crops, there are over 6,000 crops that could provide food for humans, but the vast majority of farmed crops, it's just 9 species. And so those are, because they're profitable, those are, people are taking out other species and planting more and more of things like wheat and barley and so on, which is obviously reducing our biodiversity. Similarly, the food that we eat affecting the biodiversity and the habitat type is having an impact on the other species. So there's about 100 bird species in the UK that we think will go extinct within the next 100 years if we carry on with the same farming practices that we have at the moment. Sorry, it's 100 bird species globally, not just in the UK, sorry. And this is mainly because of cattle farming, but also the increase in planting of soya and palm oil crops is also having a big effect on the birds. And we can also combine the species observations with other information to look at some of the things that you might not think are so obvious as to be what's having an effect on our biodiversity. So this article was looking at the effect of US consumers' decisions on biodiversity across the world. So the darker the purple is the more impact that's being had. And as you can see from this, there's practically nowhere in the world that biodiversity isn't being reduced because of consumer choices in America. And that's true for the UK as well. Everyone in this room has probably had an impact on global biodiversity. And it's when you start looking at it like this, linked with other things, that it starts to hit home a bit more, I think. But it can be used, the data that we have, it's not all doom and gloom. We can use it to try and improve things. So I don't know if any of you watched Blue Planet Live a couple of weeks ago. There was something similar to this on there, where there's been a lot of research done recording whale song and looking at where the whales are going, and particularly for breeding sites, and then comparing that with shipping lanes and shipping traffic. And there's been quite a large number of collisions or close calls with whales that have affected them fairly recently, but once this research has been shown, then they're able to adjust the shipping lane so there is less likely collision with whales. So all of that was our impact on biodiversity, but the biodiversity does have an impact on humans as well. It's well recorded now that access to green spaces and to connection with wildlife increases our well-being, reduces stress, and helps with our mental health. And this is a map of this area of London, and each one of the green spaces are green spaces, so it's parks, allotments, all of that sort of thing. And just having these small little places can make a big difference to people's mental health. And these are all within walking distance of this room, and it shows why London is the greenest city in Europe, and I think it's the third greenest major city in the world. And it's important that we can connect people to these areas. So another part of what we try to do with the NBN is have engagement with public, with nature, and that sort of thing. Another what I thought was quite an interesting study showed that things that harm biodiversity also have an impact on our stress and our mental health, only a negative one. It's been shown that people who know about local floods or bushfires and that sort of stuff, they become more stressed even if they were not actually affected by by the floods or the fires. So it is really intrinsically linked to our well-being. So I did promise in the abstract that I would tell you how you could help save the world. So there are a number of things you could do. Firstly, you could go and collect data. You could get your inner nature geek in, go to some of these places, and just write down what you see. There are a lot of sort of organised days or projects going on. So the Big Butterfly Count, I'm sure many of you have heard of that. There's the Garden Bird Watch. There's the Living with Mammals survey. So find what you've got, put it online. Similarly, BioBlitz is an organised event where lots of people go to the same place with the purpose of recording as much wildlife in that place as they can in one day. And these are held across London, across the UK, and they're a really good way to actually get into this, because you get a lot of training, you get a lot of support. It's a really fun day if you like being outside, obviously. You can also use one of the many apps that's been developed. My personal favourite is Project Splatter. This is where they ask people to record roadkill, which sounds horrible. Why would you want to do that? But the reason for that is the vast majority of the UK's mammals are nocturnal. And there are a lot of people who have never seen a live badger or a live fox or all of that sort of stuff. So by recording where you see them on the road, that gives us a lot of really important information about their distribution and their range. So it's not quite as gory as it sounds. The second thing you can do is actually use the data. If we've got all of this data, that's brilliant, but if we don't do anything with it, it's useless. So we're always looking for new ways to use this data, to combine it with other data sets, to look at it in new and novel ways. So if any of you have any bright ideas about what you think you could do with the data, then please do talk to us. And then finally, a shameless plug. As I said at the beginning, we are a charity. So if you like what we do, or if you use the Atlas, then it'd be great if you could think about joining us or donating something to us, some money to us, that'd be great. The other thing is we're a very small organisation, and our server space for our databases is our second largest expenditure after staff costs. So if anyone from one of the big data companies has a little bit of saver room that they could donate to us, that would be absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much.
We have some time for questions.
So hi, I'm from the London Environmental Record Centre, and obviously I understand all the problems you talked about,
yep.
And especially the last thing you said about using data. And the problem we always have is we have all this information. We have species records from volunteers, from amazing organisations, but we also have our undigitized records, and we masses of data that we don't use enough, and there's not enough focus or stress about data, and because environment is kind of categorized in the same box as biology, and people find it as it's just a science. Let the scientists deal with it. Whereas environment data is inclusive. It includes everyone in data science as well.
Yep.
So thinking if there's any any initial thoughts or initiatives to kind of focus on the data side and reach out to data scientists that aren't technically in the environment sector, biology sector, to actually get involved. Because you see them, we have people from Boosted, from learning languages, from insurance, for everything, but environment is not, you're the only kind of representative here.
Yep, that's it. I mean, and we are particularly trying to make that shift. We are, much as my background is in wildlife and conservation, the NBN is a data organisation rather than a wildlife organisation, and we really do need to have that focus to make sure that what we've got is well used. And actually, you did bring up something that I forgot to say, which is the fact that we have a lot of undigitised records. So a lot of record centres or schemes and societies have boxes full of paper records that we need to get mobilised. And we are going to be looking at including in the Atlas, there's a plugin for the Atlas that allows people to do the digitisation for the organisation. So there's a bit of the organisations can scan in the information, and then we need people to actually transpose that into records. So if you don't like going outside, then that could be some way that you can help as well.
More of a suggestion really on using data. So I'm in the process of finishing an MSc, and for pieces of our coursework, the university I'm at quite clearly pointed me to the London data store and said, use something there to do X, Y, or Z. Mm-hmm. So one suggestion is plug, and I'd never heard of NBN, is actually plugging it with some of the MSc programs or undergrad programs and saying, use this for coursework, get it out there.
Yes, exactly, yeah.
Yeah, I think there's lots of people looking for data to do coursework and dissertations.
If I could add, the London Environment Record Centre is also a social enterprise. So for people, for researchers, for anyone who actually wants to use the data for research, we give it to them.
Yeah.
And we are open about that. And that's the thing, there's not enough awareness. We are the custodian of environment data for the whole of London, and there's not enough awareness about that.
No, you're right. You're absolutely right. I've been at the MBM for 3 years now, and I'd never heard of it before I saw the job advert, to be perfectly honest with you. So we need to do a big push. And by taking on the MBN Atlas, it makes it much more appealing. Its data is readily available. You can visualise it. And so we're really trying to now get it out to this type of audience rather than conservation NGOs who know everything about it anyway. So any help, any more you can do with that would be great.
How much of an issue and what can you do about it is separating trends in collection from trends in, well, biodiversity?
Yeah, there is absolutely a bias there. As I've said a number of times, most of the data is collected by volunteers, and some of them don't like to be told where to go. They want to go and do it. They want to go back to the same site. And they don't want to be asked to go somewhere slightly different. So there are statistical tools that you can use that can account for that bias in collection. I'm not going to lie, there are some things you cannot do with this data because it's not structured in the right way, but there's plenty that can be done with it. But yeah, you do sometimes have to take account of that bias.
Any other questions?
Thank you for this really important presentation. I'm more of a data science student at the moment, and I know that data science is more of like a tool, like a bag of tools, and without questions to answer, you can't really use it. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering, is it possible that you give like a list of key questions that you would like data science to work on, so that they would kind of guide specialists to really look into your data and then try to answer those questions?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As CEO, what are your burning questions?
Unfortunately, as CEO, my burning question is where's money coming from? But yeah, there are lots of things like taxonomic gaps. Where are the areas where we haven't got any information, but we don't know if that's because someone's gone and looked and there's nothing there, or if just because nobody's gone to that particular area. So it's looking at the taxonomic gaps in combination with what's known about species richness and species distribution to identify the top places to go. Similarly, same with geographic gaps as well. But there are more sort of theoretical questions I think that can be done, like the effect, more information on the effect of the bias. Can't think of many in particular at the moment, but it's certainly something that I don't know if it might be worth. We could add something on the website maybe, as these are the the top 5 things we'd like to find out from this data, and hopefully get some data scientists in there to mine it.
I had more of an observation as well, is that some of those questions which you highlighted earlier on in the presentation about data quality, and linking that with the question of bias and the inherent error in having all of this captured by volunteers seems like a really important question where you could start to look at more complicated models.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
But a really great talk, and thank you. It's really exciting to hear about.
Thank you.
I've got another suggestion. There's a group here called Neo4j who do a thing called Graphs for Good, and if deemed worthy, they will because there's a salmon thing that they've mapped up all over the North Atlantic and the Pacific to help the specific companies not companies, sorry, the academic researchers about the flows and the genetics and all that sort of stuff, which seems very akin to what you're doing. But obviously that's on a specific species.
Yeah.
It may be worth reaching out to those to see.
So, who was it?
It's Neo4j. Hook me up afterwards, I'll talk to you about it.
By the way, I don't work for it. Hi, thank you so much. I also have an observation because you have quite a few very interesting topics. Maybe you can consider to post the data and the questions that you like data scientists to work on into Kaggle competitions. It's a worldwide platform, like data scientists would be. So we take open source data and we would provide different options of solutions. Brilliant. And just also a question in terms of if we want to encourage people to collect the data, but I think if I imagine myself to going out to take pictures, but I think to combine the education about what potentially this could be. So if there's a tool, I upload a picture and can tells me, oh, this maybe is a squirrel. Yes. Then it makes me feel more.
Yes, and it's something that we really like to do in the future is use more of those sort of tools to help with people getting engaged. I mean, if we could do a Pokemon Go for wildlife, you know, so go and find a rabbit over here.
Yeah, exactly.
That would be brilliant. Not rabbits maybe, but you know what I mean. So yeah, there are a few more things coming through, and a lot of the apps will let you do that now. And iSpot, I mentioned, which is the online resource. If you upload a photo on there, it's then sort of a crowdsourced verification. So if you upload it and say, I think this is a red squirrel, and then you get 5 other people going, yes, it's a red squirrel, then that's considered verified. Yeah, so, definitely. You know, we're a little bit behind the curve, but we're trying to catch up on that sort of thing.
So first, just an observation, because it could be quite beneficial if you introduce, kind of going a little bit back to that, but this sort of gamifying aspect. So if you had, you know, for instance, like a leaderboard for like who's doing well in collecting data, or saying like, oh, we really need some data here, you can get additional points if you go to this area, something like that could be beneficial. Yes. But then also, I was just going to ask, do you partner at all with, for example, so my partner works at an ecological consultancy, and I know they have a huge amount of data there, and it's quite objective because they actually just have cameras that are filming 24 hours a day for a long amount. So you don't have the kind of human bias of spotting just some things but missing out other things. So I was just wondering, do you ever join forces with organisations like that to get more objective data? We do work with environmental consultants. The particular I don't want to call it an issue or a problem, but for example, we work with Arcadis, who some of you would have seen a talk from one of their members earlier. Is that environmental consultants, they go out, they collect a lot of data, they use a lot of camera trapping, all of that sort of thing, and then they write their report. And sometimes there's sort of a commercial sensitivity about it, so they can't release the data. But also, there's never anything built in as time to be able to then share that data. And so consultancies, they basically, you know, a lot of the time they can't give up the time that it would need to take for them to input the data to share it, because they're not being paid for that. And we need to try and find out if there's some way that we can release that information or provide a service that might help with getting that data available. But yes, we do try and work with them. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Dirk Wortley, and someone whispered in my ear that I have the last question. So I was wondering, because so far as I understand, you are interested in creating tools to collect data, and then you store the data in the form of a repository that is accessible to other parties. I was wondering, besides that, do you have your own vision for tools for the output of data, for data visualization? I don't know, there was an interesting project by MIT a long time ago, the Sensible City, something to show the living and breathing ecosystem. Yeah. Is there any vision or idea or ambition to go in that direction?
We would love to. Again, it's getting the funding to do it, but what we have now is basically, it's fair to say it's something that's been, it's for biodiversity records recording by them and for them, and it's not really been great at bringing in the general public and so on. So what we'd really like to do is, as well as just having the data, is have information. And if you, I don't know, if you do submit a record saying thanks for that, so that's the 500th squirrel record we've had this week, you know, sort of that sort of thing. So yeah, we really are interested in looking into how we can make it more appealing rather than just the raw data, because a lot of people will see the raw data and it's like, yeah, that's great, but what the hell do I do with it? I just wanted to know what was in my park or something. But yeah, we're looking into it. Any ideas, again, very gratefully received.
Cool. Round of applause for Dr. Judge.